News Foreign Editor Sophie Mokoena will be talking to the United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres. Let's take you now live to Addis Ababa in Ethiopia and say a very good morning to you, Sophie.
Thank you, Blaine. Indeed, we are still here at the AU Summit here in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, and we are going to have a discussion with the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres about issues that are related to the continent, but we'll also look at some issues around the world. Welcome, SG. I can see.
First of all, let me congratulate South Africa. You will have the presidency of the African Union from today. You are in the Security Council, and it's always good to see South Africa very strongly engaged in international affairs.
Thank you, SG. SG, let's get down to business. The relationship, as you have pointed out, now South Africa being in the Security Council, secondly chairing the APRM, and tomorrow taking over the leadership of this continental body, the AU, the relationship between the United Nations and South Africa as a country in particular. Are you happy? Are we giving the world body enough support?
I'm extremely happy with that relationship. It's a very solid partnership. South Africa plays an extremely important role in Africa, not only from the point of view of peace and security, and we work together in several situations. Look at the mediation of South Africa in South Sudan, an absolutely vital contribution. Look at how South Africa was so useful in countries like Burundi, also South Africa was so useful in the past, in the DRC. You have been always very engaged for peace and security in the continent. On the other hand, South Africa is an economic powerhouse. A very strongly committed country with the Agenda 2030, the Agenda 2063 of the African Union, the Sustainable Development Goals, a fair globalization, and trying to push the African continent into playing a bigger and bigger role in the global economy. South Africa is also a country in which human rights are extremely important, and that for us is vital, especially in the south, to have a southern felt human rights commitment, which is also a lesson sometimes to the developed world, where people sometimes talk a lot about human rights but not necessarily practice them in many aspects. And in the Security Council, South Africa has been very active, very engaged, and really trying to create a factor of equilibrium and dialogue, namely when the big powers have difficulties in understanding each other. We know that the Security Council has been largely paralyzed, that the relations between the three biggest powers are very dysfunctional, and so the role of countries like South Africa is absolutely essential. The
country is still committed to multilateralism, in your view?
Very strongly committed to multilateralism. And it is obvious. I mean, the challenges we face today, climate change, and South Africa suffers its impact, the questions of terrorism, the questions of the risk of pandemics that we see now, all these shows that there is no way one country alone can solve them. We need multilateral institutions, we need global governance based on democratic principles, and South Africa has always been a strong advocate for this kind of multilateralism, not a multilateralism based on dominance, based on oppression, but a multilateralism based on equality, respect of sovereignty of the different countries, and international cooperation to solve common problems.
Let's talk about the continent. We have a challenge in the north, the Libya question. You were very forthright when the meeting happened in Germany a week or 2 weeks ago, complaining that it looks like there's no commitment to ensure that we deal with this conflict. What's your assessment? Have you engaged with stakeholders since your arrival on the continent?
We are extremely involved, and we have just yesterday discussed how the African Union and the UN will now work much more closely together also in relation to the Libya situation. And I understand the frustration of the African continent in relation to Libya. There was a mission led by the South African president that was going to Libya with a clear perspective of Gaddafi leaving, and all this was interrupted by the Security Council decision that led to the military intervention, and in the end led us to the situation we have today. So I fully understand this African frustration, and so I really committed myself to create a much stronger link between the AU and the UN, which will now be fully operational. But as you can imagine the frustration. We go to Berlin, we have the key countries that are interfering with the situation on the ground, committing themselves. No more interference, no more involvement, no more mercenaries, no more arms, respect for the arms embargo, and all of a sudden we come out of the meeting and everything stays the same. And the truce has been violated. Of course, there is a little bit of hope. We had a meeting of 5 military of both sides. The meeting was constructive. There is a chance that we might be able to move to a ceasefire, but it is totally unacceptable that an arms embargo decreed by the Security Council is violated in this public way, and it is a scandal that so many actors got involved in the Libyan conflict, disrespecting international law. We want a ceasefire in Libya. We want Libyans to be able to decide among themselves the future of the country, and we want to work closely with the African Union to make it possible. And we are very happy with the decision to convey in Africa a forum of reconciliation, a large meeting of reconciliation, very inclusive, with all the key actors in Libya, not only the parties to the conflict now, helping to hopefully create the conditions for Libya to be stable. And the stability of Libya is vital for the security of the continent. Libya is largely responsible for the progress of terrorism in the Sahel or in the Lake Chad. We are witnessing in these areas a progression of terrorism. The mechanisms of security that are in place are not enough. I've been strongly advocating, without success, but strongly advocating for the need to have peace enforcing and counter-terrorism African operations supporting by the Security Council and the Chapter 7 of the Charter, and with assessed contributions, mandatory contributions, to have the resources needed to be effective in the fight against terrorism, and also massive economic support, because there is no security without development, so the two things need to move together. And unfortunately, until now, the international community has failed in providing the G5 Sahel and the other countries of the region what is needed to be able to guarantee their own security and guarantee our common security. Because what's happening in the Sahel is not a problem of the Sahel, it's a problem of the whole continent, and it's a problem of the world.
You've spoken of Sahel. Let's talk about South Sudan. South Sudan, another problem there. It looks like the leaders don't want to agree to starting an interim government or government of national unity. What's the problem? They keep postponing.
I think I lived the problem of South Sudan very strongly because as I Commissioner for Refugees, my first visit was to Uganda, to a South Sudanese refugee camp, where I saw the enormous joy of the people that after the peace agreement were expecting to go back. And I once traveled by truck from northern Uganda to close to EA, accompanying a family that was going back to the country after the peace was established. Can you imagine the frustration that after helping 500,000 South Sudanese go back home, we see millions of South Sudanese again being displaced by this conflict and an enormous suffering? I mean, malnutrition, sexual violence, rape, extreme poverty. And I think the leaders of Sudan need to understand that they are there to serve the people. The people is suffering. So it's their moral obligation to understand that they must compromise and they must come to an agreement and they must create the conditions for peace to be stabilized in South Sudan. And so I hope they will be probably meeting here. I hope that they will come to an understanding allowing a government of national unity to be formed as it was decided, and making sure that the leaders are able to deserve the people they have. It's a wonderful people. They deserve the leaders to assume their responsibilities.
Let's talk about another important issue, climate change. We saw the meeting in France. It looks like it didn't go far enough in terms of commitment by world leaders.
You mean in Madrid?
In Madrid,
COP25.
Because, yes, COP25. It looks like there was no commitment. What's your view? Are the leaders of the world trying enough or doing enough to ensure that we address the issue of climate change?
Things are different in different countries, and things are different for different companies or different businesses or different people. People are gaining conscience that climate change is the defining issue of our time. It's the biggest threat to humankind. And so we see the youth mobilizing, we see civil society mobilizing, we see several companies, several businesses reshaping the way they work in order to be carbon neutral. What we still lack is political will in large parts of the world. It is absolutely essential. We had a summit in New York where more than 70 countries committed to carbon neutrality in 2050, which is necessary according to the scientific community to contain climate change. But the big emitters have not yet done so. And so the big emitters have this responsibility. They need to commit to carbon neutrality in 2050. They need to commit to end the addiction to coal, and I know coal is a very important thing in South Africa, but I know the efforts South Africa is making. It was your legacy from the past, but you are making efforts now to progressively change your energy supply. But other countries are still building new coal power plants. At the same time, we see subsidies to fossil fuels that are going on. We see the lack of a price on carbon. I always say tax carbon, not people. I mean, tax carbon, and then the money that you get from it, reduce taxes on people, on salaries. There is still not enough political will to do what is necessary, but we insist it's vital that countries commit to carbon neutrality by 2050. We need to defeat climate change because climate change is defeating us. And a continent like Africa is really in the front line. Africa contributes very little to climate change, but Africa is suffering the impacts of climate change in a dramatic way. In storms, like Mozambique recently, in drought, locusts, and drought is becoming also a factor of instability and a supporter of terrorism. In the Sahel, one of the things that creates confrontations between farmers and herders is the fact that climate change is increasing drought in a very dramatic way.
Let's talk about the health matters, the current outbreak of coronavirus. The World Health Organization is working very hard to deal with that challenge. Are you happy thus far?
I think this is a huge challenge. I believe an enormous effort is being made, but we still have a long way to go. I think we need a lot of international solidarity, and we need a lot of commitment by everybody to make sure that we contain the spread of the disease. And the African continent needs to be prepared, and WHO has at the disposal of all African countries for that. And we also need to avoid the stigmatization of people, to have a human rights-minded approach to this epidemic. But it is a big concern, and I hope that we will be able to contain it before it becomes a global pandemic.
And finally, SG, talking about women issues, the coming summit in France, where we'll take stock of what transpired in Beijing. Is it all systems go for this big summit in Beijing, where women will gather again and look at their role in the global world?
We unfortunately are seeing a pushback in relation to human rights, and this is a question of power. We live in a male-dominated world with a male-dominated culture, and that is why it is so important to make sure that women play more and more a relevant role in leading international organizations, in governments, in parliaments, in the boards of companies. I'm very happy that we reached, in the 1st of January, full parity, with 90 men and 90 women in the top positions of the United Nations Secretariat and funds of programs. And I think the same must happen everywhere. We need to push back against the pushback, and we need to make gender equality a full priority for the international community. Women have a fantastic role when they engage as peacemakers, as mediators. We wouldn't have the conflicts we have without this male-dominated culture in different parts of the world. Women are much more committed to human rights. Women have a bigger sense of justice in relation to development. So to have women in positions of responsibility, to have a shift of power for equilibrium in gender is, in my opinion, a fundamental contribution for gender equality, and gender equality is a fundamental contribution for a better world.
Thank you for your time, SG. I know you have lots of appointments lined up, meeting different leaders, where you're trying to communicate your message to leaders directly. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, and my warm regards to all those hearing us.
Thank you. Secretary-General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, here at the AU Summit in Addis Ababa, talking about the range of issues, peace, health matters, women issues. And now it's back to you, Blaine, in studio in Johannesburg.
Sophie, appreciate that SABC News exclusive with the man in charge of the world body, Antonio Guterres, the Secretary-General, talking about pertinent issues, important material issues on the African continent. South Sudan, big talking point. Libya, big talking point. Climate change. The SG was talking about climate change, and Africa contributes very little in terms of climate change, but suffers a lot. When he talks about gender equality, he says we need to push back the pushback. So very important issues coming out of that exclusive, SABC News exclusive with the United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres. We'll try to replay that interview in a short while, so stand by for that. Sophie Mokoena, live for us in Addis Ababa. Thank you. While